Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I am proud and happy today to be hosting the launch of our new book, edited by Jean Pisani-Ferry and myself, The Green Frontier, Assessing the Economic Implications of Climate Action. This book is the result of a lot of intellectual leadership by Jean and our pulling together of a number of distinguished economists from global community, international organizations, academia. The issue is anybody reasonable knows we have to do something about the climate, and the evidence is clear. The issue now is, given the pledges, how do we get from here to there? And as seen in recent politics in the US, in Western Europe, including France, in various countries around the world, the political path, even where there seems to be success in transitioning to green technologies, has been quite fraught. And the usual assumptions made are either wishful that the green transition will in and of itself pay for itself and everything will be fine, or doom-laden that the political and economic costs are too high and we're just not going to get there, so grow up. Or occasionally, but still not terribly helpfully, well, we'll do like we did on trade, we'll just buy off the opposition, but of course we didn't actually do that. So where Jean and I set out, and again, I want to thank Jean profoundly for his contributions to the Institute and to this topic, was to say macroeconomically, political economy, and importantly, internationally, how do we get from here to there? And as Jean will set out, we have a path. It's not easy, but it is more than economically viable, and it is attainable. And there are certain questions that have to be dealt with at a political level, but there are certain things that are known about economics, and in particular, the core point is this is going to be solved through technology, and that means a replacement of capital, and that means a series of transitions and a needed set of international and macroeconomic policies to facilitate those transitions. And Jean will take us through this. We are very privileged today, among the many authors contributing to the Green Frontier, three very distinguished economists, public servants, and scholars. Pierre-Olivier Garinchas, the economic counselor and head of research at the IMF. Heather Boucher, member of the Council of Economic Advisors and a leading member of the economic thought patterns of the Biden administration. And Robert Lawrence, formerly a member of the Council of Economic Advisors and now the, sorry, I always get his chair's name wrong, Albert L. Williams Professor of Trade and Investment at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. I will give a slightly longer bio for each of them before we ask them to start. This meeting is entirely on the record. We look forward to a lively discussion and taking forward us all towards the green frontier. So first speaking will be Jean. Jean, I'm proud to say, remains a non-resident senior fellow here at the Peterson Institute. He is also a senior fellow at Bruegel, the European think tank that he founded. He's had a distinguished career in France and Europe. He recently handed a major report to the French Prime Minister on the economic consequences of climate action. In 2017, he was a key participant in Emmanuel Macron's presidential bid, and from 2013 to 2016, he served as Commissioner General of France Strategie, the ideas lab of the French government. He's done a number of things in Brussels, as well as spending 10 years as the founding director of Bruegel. He is writing at present important things on the situation in France. He has co-edited and co-authored a set of work on economic security strategy, but again, we're very proud to have been the locus for much of his climate efforts beyond his report to the French Prime Minister as embodied in the Green Frontier. Speaking second will be Heather Boucher. Heather is a member of President Biden's Council of Economic Advisors and chief economist to the Investing in America cabinet. She's one of the nation's most influential voices on economic policy, and she has been committed to issues of economic inequality, growth, and public policy for her career. She was co-founder of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, where she was president and CEO from 2013 to 2020. She was also chief economist for Secretary Clinton's 2016 transition team and has previously worked at the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress, as well as a number of think tanks. Following her will be Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas, the Economic Counselor and Director of Research at the IMF. He's on leave for the University of California, Berkeley, where he is the S.K. and Angela Chan Professor of Global Management at the Department of Economics in the Haas School of Business. He's also the laureate of the 2007 Bernanke Prize for the best European economist working in macroeconomics and finance, then under the age of 40. He also won another fancy prize. Pierre-Olivier is one of the leading open economy macroeconomists of his generation, and we've all learned from him. Robert Lawrence, who I'm proud to admit was on my dissertation committee, he may not be proud, but I'm proud, is a non-resident senior fellow with the Peterson Institute since 2001. He joined us after service as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Clinton from March 1999 to January 2001. He had a previous career across the street at the Brookings Institution as a senior fellow from 1983 to 1991, and then held the New Century Chair at the Brookings Institution from 1993 until he joined President Clinton's CEA. He's been a leading policy economist and scholar on issues of trade, development, manufacturing. His new book with the Institute on the possibilities for manufacturing to deliver sustained income growth will be out in the fall, and we'll look forward to hosting him then. So this is an all-star panel. This is the most important issue, and we think we're coming up with the most practical response. With that, let me turn it over to Jean. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. I'm really very happy to be here for the release, for the launch of this book. When we started this project, we started from the view that there was no real macroeconomic conversation about the consequences of climate action. And so our ambition was to trigger this conversation. But we didn't know how it would develop. And you know, there are different types of disagreements and therefore different types of conversations. They're the ones in which you don't find a common ground. It's like, if you wish, the wars of religion or the wars of paradigm. There is no middle point between the Ptolemaic paradigm and the Copernican paradigm. One is true and the other is wrong. And we didn't know if, speaking of climate, we would end up observing there is a serious conversation that can develop, or whether it would end up being fruitless because of this paradigmatic controversy. And this book brings good news. It brings the good news that there is a conversation that can develop. So not everybody agrees on everything, obviously, but that's precisely why there can be a conversation. So let me take you through some of the points of agreement and some of the points of disagreement that remain. So before that, so we cover in the book a very wide range of topics. So we started from a macro observation that we didn't have a sort of a good macro assessment of the consequences of climate action. But in the process, we opened a number of discussions, which are listed here. Adam already mentioned the political economy dimension, which is obviously paramount in this kind of of discussion. Public finance is also of major importance, but we have also other topics, and those topics are explored in the book. I'm not going to list all of them here. Okay, on the areas of consensus and dissensus. So we took the risk in the introduction to indicate where we think there is broad agreement and when we think there is disagreement and what the nature of this disagreement. So this is indicative of the fact that the macroeconomic analysis of climate action has made progress, that we have this possibility of identifying points of consensus and points of dissensus, and we have the possibility of moving forward on resolving the disagreement. So, consensus first. We identified 6 issues on which we think there is a broad consensus. The first is obviously that whatever the views on the economic consequences of climate action, it has to be undertaken, it has to be carried through, because no action would be much worse. And that's a common theme of virtually all participants in the discussion. The second is that innovation will play a key role. And that's probably, it's not a novelty for everyone, because I remember a paper by Philippe Aghion and Darren Acemoglu back in 2009, which already made the point, but it has gained traction. And by now, the consensus is there that innovation is part of the game, and innovation facilitates the search for a solution. This is spectacular. This is spectacular in a number of fields. I mean, for example, the International Energy Agency regularly updates the forecast, and each time it updates its forecast, the previous forecast is overtaken by the next one. So that's good news, and that's certainly part of the solution. A full betting exclusively on innovation would still be a mistake, but clearly innovation is part of the answer. Third, and that brings us back to the political economy point, there will be losers. Some households, some companies, some workers will be negatively affected, and this has to be recognized. Robert is going to develop on this point in his presentation, I think, in a moment. But it's our strong view that if climate action ends up being blocked, it will be blocked because of an insufficient consideration of the adverse consequences of it on some categories. We just had an example recently when in Germany they introduced the regulation or the legislation, and in fact that if you change your boiler, you have to change it for a heat pump or for a carbon neutral boiler. And this triggered immediately an uproar, and the government had to backtrack. So that's because it didn't provide sufficient support to help people contribute, be players, be actors in this transition, and that requires obviously fiscal means. Fourth, but I already alluded to that, the magnitude of the job displacement is limited, but there are still, sticking points. The fifth, heterogeneity of climate policies. is here to stay. This was a big discovery for the Europeans when they learned that Biden would rejoin President Biden would rejoin the Paris Agreement. They thought problem solved, but in fact not, because President Biden joined, but has a completely different strategy from the European strategy, and so the heterogeneity there is here to stay. And this much broader heterogeneity of climate policies. And actually, in a way, this is good news, because this means that there is ownership of the strategy in the various countries. But the world has to accommodate these differences. 6, the global south is very vulnerable to transition risks. The battle for climate will be won or lost in the south, because the investment needs are enormous. It's striking when you compare the investment needs that are required in the advanced countries. It's sort of 2 to 3% of GDP, but it's twice as much in India, in South Africa, in Indonesia, etc. And the fiscal space is very limited. Savings are not there. So as a consequence, those countries, they continue building coal-fired power plants because that's what you can afford, and because the investment cost of a coal-fired power plant is much less than the investment cost of another carbon-neutral power plant, whatever the technology. So that's something also on which there is agreement. Now, on points of contention, we listed 4. Which we think are important, but are not of a sort of war of paradigms nature. They are important discussions on which progress can be made, and progress is being made. So the first is the growth impact, the medium-term growth impact of the transition. This is a quite confusing, or this was a quite confusing issue, because the initial assessment was that because there will be investment, because massive investment is required, this will trigger growth through sort of basic Keynesian mechanisms. So, as I will explain in a minute, things are a bit more complicated. Second, the range of estimate for the price of carbon needed to reach net zero is wide, is very wide, and I'll go back to that. Third, there is an issue on the choice of instruments to incentivize the private sector transition, and this choice of instruments remains in dispute, and that's takes us back to this, the different strategies and how to accommodate the differences. And fourth, fiscal consequences. It's clear that there will be fiscal consequences, but we don't know yet if they will be major or minor, and there is a debate about that. Okay, let me go in more detail into these dimensions. The growth impact, if you simplify what is the transition away from fossil fuels, the decarbonization process, it's basically a substitution of capital for fossil fuels. That doesn't mean there are no other mechanisms. There are other mechanisms, but the main mechanism is this one. So it's potentially profitable because it implies lower operating expenses down the but it requires upfront investment. I'm using this graph, which is taken from the Climate Change Committee of the UK, because they've done all the assessment. So above the line, you have CapEx. And the level they reach, 60 billion pounds, is about 2.5% of GDP. So as you see, it's quite steep. And the implication in terms of lower OPEX comes, but gradually. That's what you see below the line. Below the line, you see the gains in terms of operating expenses. So it's essentially massive substitution of capital for fossil fuels. That delivers, but that delivers over time. And that's the difficulty of the transition. Now, the ambiguity about the growth effect is that obviously on the demand side, the investment is a boost to growth. But on the supply side, those investments, they don't increase the potential output. They're substituted to investment that would increase either capacity or efficiency. So it's a different sort of efficiency, but the consequences is that it's not contributing to the improvement, progress in potential output in the medium run. And you can differentiate depending on how it is financed, and whether it's investment as a substitution to existing investment, or if it's in addition to existing investment. So that's my first point of discussion. So the lesson from the work and the several papers, including one by Pierre Olivier in the book. There is one by World Bank economist, Stéphane Algat, and so there are several. There's one by, obviously, the John Hassler and Per Krusel. I mean, many of the papers deal with this issue. So it's a discussion that is taking shape, but it hasn't reached a conclusion that's sufficiently precise. The second question is the price of carbon that would be needed to trigger this transformation. And here the range of estimate is very wide. I mean, I'm quoting, the $20 per ton figure of Hassler, Krusel, and Olofsson. They don't say it's, what's needed to reach net zero, but they say this is already this will already have a substantial effect. Then you have the Pierre Wunsch, the governor of the Bank of Belgium, who gave a lecture and said, the marginal abatement cost is $300 per ton. So enormous range. Why is it? It's not because of different concepts. I mean, it's not because some of those numbers are based on the intertemporal optimization, like the social cost of carbon, and some other on the dual of the quantity constraint. Actually, the numbers that come up, depending on the concept that's being used, are relatively close. So it's not a matter of differences in concepts. It's an empirical matter. So there is a case for narrowing down this range of estimate because, and obviously, in the international context, it's of major importance to see if there is a possibility of reaching an agreement, or if not reaching an agreement, at least narrowing down the differences. Sorry. Linked to that, the question of the choice of instruments. There is still this discussion. There is still divergence between countries on which instrument they use in priority. So it's clear that carbon pricing has desirable properties, including the fact that it does not mandate how the private sector is going to achieve carbon neutrality. It sort of put a price and externality, and then private sector decides how to do that. So that clearly a plus, but the problem is that where it has been tried, it has triggered a backlash. And there is resentment. It doesn't pass spontaneously. There's a sort of political economy. It doesn't meet the political economy constraint. Subsidy, on the other hand, do meet the political economy constraints, but at a high fiscal cost. And then the regulation, which is a sort of third possibility, can be effective, but puts the burden on private agents. So it's in a way out, but that's not a very good way out because, as I said, when you're telling agents you've got to change your boiler and we don't pay for the extra cost, that does not go down well with household. So question is a mixed strategy. And I think, in fact, there is a certain degree of convergence on the desirability of a mixed strategy. The question is what the right mix and what the range of differences that can be accommodated. So agreement on the desirability on the mixed strategy, but not on the proportions. And finally, the fiscal consequences. As I said, there's no quantitative agreement. The IMF, not Pierre Olivier, but his colleague Victor Gaspard and co-author Ruud de Moy, they've put in the fiscal monitor of a year ago that current policies are not scalable. And I think this is an important finding. I mean, that's true for the US, that's true for Europe, that's true in many places of the world. So at some point, you've got to define, to decide how you make your climate action compatible with sustainability. So there's a whole discussion on the degree to which the climate transition can be financed by debt, because it's a temporary investment, and since it's a temporary investment, it does not jeopardize sustainability, but it does increase the level of public debt, so it has to come with a very strict fiscal policy for the rest. But we don't know yet how important the cost will be, and I think that's a major discussion going forward. Okay, I'm essentially done. I would wish to conclude with a few policy implications that are listed here. I'm not going to list them one by one, but essentially, especially as it repeats things I've said already, I think the fact that having gone through this discussion, we're able to come up with some policy implication is in itself important. It shows that the disagreements are not an obstacle to action. They're just indicative of what remains to be done and to be addressed for this action to be effective. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. I really appreciated that summary. I enjoyed reading what I did of the book. I was here a little bit for the conference, and also very happy to have the hardback. I say all that because I think that this is an incredibly important topic, and it was an incredibly important conversation that was had here. I want to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing in the Biden White House on these issues. And I have some slides that get a little bit technical. We'll see how far. I'm going to stick to time. But mostly, I want to just sort of make some comments about how critical building this community of practice is for policymakers who have to make decisions about how to incorporate these issues into their economic thinking and planning. And so I want to just start with a huge congratulations to Jean and to Adam and to all of the contributors to this volume, because from where I sit, almost nothing could be more important than assessing how we can think about the macroeconomic implications. And as we were talking over breakfast, to make sure that this is a smooth transition so that we can get through those political economy hurdles that John ended with on that. I believe it was number 3 on that last slide. Okay, so let's go straight to how we've been seeing the problem. Oh, I have a clicker, great. So here's how we've been seeing the problem inside the US government. For those of you who have not served or don't know the US system, I'm at the Council of Economic Advisors. And the Council of Economic Advisors, along with the US Treasury and the Office of Management and Budget, puts together the economic assumptions for the US federal budget. So in other countries, that often happens in the finance ministry. In the United States, it happens with what is called this troika. And the Council of Economic Advisors has the lead forecaster for that process. And so we have been thinking over the past few years, there's an executive order in year 1 that asked us to think about new methods for incorporating physical damages and transition risk into our economic assumptions. So this is the problem statement that we have put together as we've been doing our work. What do the economic assumptions currently capture? What do they not capture? Of course, at this point, they do not capture the full set of damages from a changing climate. They do not capture changes to capital investment and labor demand as we make the transition to clean energy. They will retroactively, but not prospectively. They don't capture the effect of supply chain bottlenecks and what effects that could have on the transition, nor the changes to trade patterns in a clean energy economy, or the effects of adaptation and other resiliency measures on macro outcomes, or the interactions between physical and transition risks. So a long list there. Many of these things are echoed in the chapters in the book. And so we have been setting out to, okay, well, how do we do this? How do we begin to start to incorporate this? So in the first year of our work, we put out a white paper that was an assessment of what kinds of modeling tools we had across the US government, who was thinking about these questions, and how we could start addressing the question. What did we have in front of us? And one of the things that we know is that the United States actually has a very deep and rich system of modelers across the government. On the left side of the screen are the work that has been done on climate models, been happening across government, both at the EPA as well as NOAA. These models tend to be global in scope. They tend to have very long timescales, decades or centuries. The key interactions around the atmosphere, land, ocean, sea ice. On the other hand, we have a rich set of work on energy systems. We've been working most closely with the Pacific Northwest Laboratory, I think I missed a word there, PNNL, that has been developing a model for many years. These models also tend to be global, not always. They also tend to have long timescales, decades. And the key interactions are technology and natural resources. How are you thinking about what kind of energy transition you can have? So on the one hand, the climate models tell us what the physical damages can be, what are the effects of climate change, and the energy models tell us how a different world is possible, how we can model, how we can make a transition from fossil fuels to clean energy technologies. And in the middle, we have the macro models, which is what we play with at the Council of Economic Advisors. This is a national model. The time scale is in months, quarters, years, and the interactions, I like to think of this as the people part of it. It's where you're going through the human systems, households, business, governments. How are all of these playing out? I think it's really important in starting any of these conversations to note that these 3 different modeling systems were developed independently. These communities do not generally know each other. One of the things that we started doing in year 1 was seeded a National Academy of Sciences panel to bring together these 3 communities in a room and to do a series of workshops to have people start to have that conversation, get to know each other. I think it was the third session where somebody finally turned to me. It was actually a woman from NOAA who said, "Heather, just tell me what you need. And I can give you what we have from NOAA." And I looked at her and I was like, "What do you have? Like, what, I don't know, what do you have? How can I, So, and I think that actually summarized one of the key issues that we've discovered through this National Academy of Sciences work is just creating that communication across the different modeling teams so they can understand how we can connect the dots. Okay, so over the next couple of years, we have done a series of white papers that have looked at, the first one, as I said, literature review, what does the US government have? Year 2 is, okay, given what we have, what is the easiest way that we can move forward to incorporate physical damages and transition risk? So we laid out a methodology in year 2, and then in year 3, we have outlined how to actually do that. So we put out this 45-page paper that we think of as a recipe. If you want to do macro forecasting, incorporating physical risk and transition risk, here's the steps that you need to go through. So we put together a step-by-step approach to quantifying climate risks in a macroeconomic forecasting framework. And one of the things that we learned through going through this process, again, it was through an interagency technical working group, about 30 to 50 people across the US government. One of the things we learned in doing this is that there are a number of moments where the macro forecaster does not have a literature to rely on. So in the paper, there's really 8 moments where the forecaster has to step back and they would have to make a decision that nobody's made before, or there's no literature. And of course, the US government can't go out blazing into uncharted territory. So our white paper is really a call for help. I like to think of it as the paper that should launch 1,000 dissertations of how to really dig into each of these moments and really do an assessment. And some of the papers in this volume are looking at some of those. And we will continue to track this, but there's a lot of questions that you have to ask. And I will end with this slide, which is just kind of to give you a quick flavor of how we've thought about this. It's a little small up there. But when we do our economic forecast, we start with a simple, a very straightforward supply side decomposition of GDP. And so really it comes down to the high level factors which determine labor supply and labor productivity. And look at how these indicators are, that's what the forecast does, right? And so what we've done is try to assess, okay, how do physical damages, on the one hand, and for which we go through 4 moments where there are questions the modeler needs to ask themselves, how do those affect these indicators? And then how will the transition to clean energy affect these sets of indicators? Going through them each one by one. I want to end by noting that from our perspective in the US government, we need to figure out how to not only do a clean energy transition, where many of my colleagues at the Department of Energy and the Climate Policy Office and the Office of Clean Energy Innovation and Investment, all these other places are working on the implementation. But our job as economists in this moment is to help make sure that this process can be as smooth as possible. And so that we understand that we are going to be up against these fiscal constraints. We do need to think about how the technology curves may be moving faster or slower than the models are predicting. My assessment is a lot of times these are actually moving faster than our models have predicted. We do need to think about how all of this is going to affect global supply chains, how it might affect inflation and other macroeconomic indicators, so that then policymakers can make better and more informed decisions about how to think about both fiscal and monetary policy so that this can be as smooth as possible. So I could not be more excited about this volume, and I encourage everyone here in the room, but especially any of those of you watching, to take a look at it. And if you are a budding graduate student in macro or in other econ fields, highly encourage you to check out this, because they think that this is, I think, one of the most important fields for the next decade. So thank you.
So thank you. First, thank you to Jean and Adam for putting this really important book together and gathering an impressive list of contributors on really all of the different aspects of the climate transition and the challenges that we're facing. I think I learned a lot from the different contributions, and it was really a pleasure to be part of this effort. And so I'm also very happy to be here on the day of the launch of the book. I think it's a wonderful event. I think the book highlights that three key messages, and Jean has already kind of summarized some of the main takeaways, and some of the things I'm going to say will echo and overlap with his remarks. The first one is innovation is key to drive the green transition and make it politically sustainable. The second one is the political economy challenges need to be taken very seriously. And the third one is that the macroeconomic cost, at the aggregate level at least, of the climate transition are in fact manageable. They may not be, as Jean pointed out, there is disagreement on whether we have a slight positive or a slight negative, but even if it's a negative, it's not a huge negative, especially when you compare it with the alternative of not doing anything. So let me now expand on each of these points and offer some perspective, both in light of the chapter that we contributed to the book, which was kind of an overview of some of these issues, but also in light of some of the developments, I think, since last year when the Peterson Institute held a conference where these different contributions were presented, because I think there have been some developments that are relevant here. So first on innovation and technology. So in absolute agreement that innovation is key to the success of the green transition. Without innovation, carbon emissions would have to be lowered entirely by reducing economic activity. If the link between emissions and activity remains the same, then there's only way to reduce emissions to reduce activity, and that's a very unpalatable proposition. And that's one that would not be politically sustainable either within countries or across countries. Now, in this context, one of the things that I think is a little bit worrisome is that when we look at the data, the number of green patents that have been issued recently, as the rate of growth of green patents has slowed down, and I think that's we have to be concerned about that, because clearly the rate of innovation is very important. There have been tremendous progress, and I'll come back on that, but the rate of innovation seems to be slowing down a little bit. Now, at the fund, we've done some work on how it's possible to boost green innovation. We have a staff discussion note that came out last year in time for the conference and parties in November that illustrated how we could implement policies that would boost green innovation. And how different types of climate policies could play a role there, whether it's regulation or taxation of carbon emissions or other measures to incentivize the development and adoption of green technologies. Now, one of the things that this work emphasized is the importance of credible policy commitments. And that's something that is often an important element of the whole policy spectrum here. Is economic actors are making decisions that are about changing, going from one system to another. They need clarity. They need to have some sense that the commitments that are taken at a point in time are going to be maintained in the future. And this credibility of policy commitments is really important. And in fact, you can think about it a little bit like you think about the credibility of monetary policy announcements, in a sense that, you know, without the lack of credibility on monetary policy, you get all kinds of bad outcomes and lack of investment or maybe inflation. Well, you have a similar trade-off when you're thinking about climate policies. So this is key to influence long-term investment decisions by private actors, and these investment decisions are absolutely needed, and that's true also for research and development or adoption of new technologies. The international agreements, the international dimension is also very important here, and it tends to boost green innovation strongly. That was one of our findings, that international agreements on climate have a strong effect on green innovation. And so global momentum on climate policy is very important. The government also has a role to play directly in deploying resources that will help with basic research towards new technologies. So for instance, green hydrogen or negative emissions technologies. These are going to be important in some sectors of the economy, and they are still currently very expensive, so much more needs to be done on that front. Now, still on the question of innovation and technology, it's important to innovate, but it's not enough. Innovation happens mostly in advanced economies and in China. We need these technologies to also be deployed in low-income countries, in emerging economies around the world. So there has to be a process by which these green technologies can be transferred. And that's absolutely critical. And so that goes through trade, lowering trade barriers, implementation of climate policies that help direct investment in green technologies, or financial transfers that will allow lower income countries to basically deploy and access this type of technologies. Now, one important message, I think, in the book, for instance, in chapter 3, is that green innovation, I mean, yes, it can be costly at first because you have to pay the upfront cost and there can be some impact on that, but that's also going to be beneficial over time, and it's going to be beneficial along two dimensions. I mean, Jean pointed out the fact that initially, at least, you're replacing mature technologies that are quite efficient in generating energy with less mature technologies. Therefore, there's an element of an adverse supply shock here. That's true at first. It's less true for these emerging and low-income countries I mentioned, because they are not yet fully at scale in terms of their energy production. So for them transitioning to renewable, there is less of an element of substitution. But it's also not true if you look further down the line, because these are also industries where we're seeing tremendous learning by doing and productivity improvements. So eventually there will also be productivity gains there as well. So green innovation can definitely be beneficial for growth over time, and I think that's one of the points that was highlighted in that chapter. Now let me turn to the second point on the political economy challenges. And here, I think there are 4 issues that are very important, and they remain very important. And they, in fact, if anything, they've grown in importance since last year, certainly over the last few years. The first one is, has been mentioned already, the distributional effects of climate policies is critical. Carbon taxation, for instance, disproportionately affects low and middle income households. To many countries, climate policy is described as an elite project, relying on the erroneous assumption that it requires substantial economic sacrifices. There can be sacrifices, but they're not necessarily substantial at the aggregate level, although as some of the chapters, and Robert will speak to that, some communities can be certainly very adversely affected. The second point is the fragmentation of economic systems that we have been witnessing that started a while ago, but is accelerating, if anything, with a tendency to reshore economic activity, to introduce trade barriers that will limit the diffusion of new technologies. And from that perspective, there is a danger that we're using, that's a remark I made here at the Peterson Institute, in the context of the conference that was hosted in April on how to steer structural change, that too often trade policy is just a way of doing domestic redistribution policy by other means, and it's a very inefficient way of doing that. The third point is concerns about energy security, become very acute, of course, following Russia's unlawful invasion of Ukraine, and has led some countries to increase investments in brown energy production, coal and gas, since 2022. And the last point is the smaller fiscal space following the pandemic, the higher interest rates that have been deployed by central banks to bring inflation down. Fiscal space has been reduced, and this has, at the margin, an impact probably on funding for clean technologies to their front-loaded investment profiles. So all of these political economy challenges are important. And I would argue that during the past year, these developments have become even more pronounced. Fragmentation has persisted, and countries still use industrial policy to reshore production of low-carbon technology. Recent elections, my own country is in the middle of one, shows that climate policy has lost momentum with the electorate in many parts of the advanced world, despite increasing urgency. And these elections also create further uncertainty on future government spending and climate policy that are also detrimental to implementing a smooth transition, and potentially can increase the cost of borrowing for governments, further reducing fiscal space and then further impairing the green transition. Now, in chapter 5 of the book, my colleague Vitor Gaspar and Ruud de Moij have this concept which I like, which is that of a climate policy trilemma. We don't exactly know how to do the investments we need, public investments we need for climate, while at the same time making sure that their dynamics remain sustainable when the fiscal space has been very eroded, and at the same time making sure that there is political economy buy-in for doing this. Of these three things, it's very hard to see how they can be combined going forward. Now, in our own chapter of the book, with my co-authors Antonio Spilimbergo and Gregor Jarosz, we argued that the climate transition is a race between technology and this political backlash, that somehow there's been very good news on the technology side, and more is needed. In the sense we've been in the steep part of the S curve whether you think about photovoltaic or you think about batteries, we've been on the steep part, the almost exponential part of the S curve early on, wherein in fact climate systems have been evolving more at a linear rate, and therefore we've been catching up in that sense and making progress. That's very good. You can see the implication of this in, for instance, the price of the solar panels, or the price of producing, the levelized price of producing energy with renewable resources that has been coming down tremendously over the last few years. But at the same time, these political economy challenges have been becoming more severe and more adverse. I would also argue that since last year, I'm maybe a little bit less sanguine about the rate at which the climate system is evolving. I mean, one graph that has really shook me is the figure that showed the sea surface temperatures over the last 40 years. And even the rate of increase was pretty moderate and incremental from 1980 to 2022. And then you see a big jump in sea surface temperatures. And that, to me, is indicating that we might be entering into a place where the climate system is becoming much less stable and much less predictable. So in this area of political economy challenges, there is more we can do. This is how I think, and that will be my last point about the macroeconomic cost of the green transition. This is where I think we have to be absolutely honest brokers of the economic analysis as the places like the IMF, et cetera, when we're looking at the macroeconomic costs. There is, of course, a tendency to try to present optimistic scenarios to get buy-in from everyone on the climate transition. I think that has to be resisted. I think the experience we've had with globalization, which overall I think delivers tremendous benefits in the aggregate, but has distributional cost. I think the political economy discourse that was produced was too often one that ignored the distributional implication, focused only on the aggregate, and that has consequences later on. And I think it's very important to avoid making similar mistakes when we're thinking about the climate transition. So the question then is how to make it more socially acceptable. And here we're doing some work at the fund on this. We're actually preparing one of our chapters for the upcoming World Economic Outlook in the fall. Is going to be looking more generally at how ways in which structural reforms can be made more socially acceptable. And that was also one of the themes of this Peterson conference I mentioned back in April on how to steer structural change. Now, we've done some work on how communication about climate policies can increase their social acceptance. And the results that we have so far is that it's not very effective to inform people about the consequences of doing nothing. What is effective is to explain how climate mitigation policies work, what they're doing, and what their impact is going to be. And people seem mostly interested in the ability of climate policy to reduce emissions and also understand their distributional implications and co-benefits, for instance, especially on health. If you think about reducing emissions, that also has implications for air quality in urban environments, for instance, that are quite sizable. Now, my final point is on the macroeconomic costs of the green transition. Now, this is the topic that we at the fund, we've been looking at for quite some time. And here, again, the bottom line is that the costs are, if there are costs, in which we do find in our estimates, those costs are relatively modest at the aggregate level. And therefore, they should really not be a deterrent to embarking on the transition. But the distributional issues, as I said, are important. For instance, we looked at a policy package that would consist of carbon taxation, transfers to household, subsidies for low-emitting technologies, and some labor tax cuts using the revenues from carbon taxation to reduce payroll taxes. And a package that would, in our simulations, help reduce emissions by about 25% by 2030, which is basically putting us on the path for the Paris Agreement. And that would that would reduce global economic growth by something like 0.15 percentage point to 0.25 percentage point annually from now until 2030. So it's not zero. It's negative, but it's certainly manageable in light of what you accomplish on the other side of the ledger. So this is certainly something that we think is important to do more work on, to understand exactly the channels and how those costs are manifest themselves and through what mechanisms, but they certainly don't appear to be enormous. Now, when designing international climate policy, and that would be my last point, as the Paris Agreement does, it's important that the burden of climate mitigation is also spread fairly across countries. And here, I think this is an area where we're concerned because we're seeing less agreement maybe than what would be needed. We're seeing, of course, different large economies going in different direction. And the amount of coordination is maybe insufficient. Now, we at the IMF, we're doing all we can, in a sense, both in terms of deploying instruments that would help countries, especially low-income countries, be more resilient to the climate challenges that they're facing. We have a new facility that's more of a long-term facility, our Resilience and Sustainability Trust. But we're also playing a role that's an important role in convening governments around the table and authorities and making sure that everyone understands what the spillovers from decisions on climate policy in one country or part of the world are on other parts of the world. And I think from that perspective, the book that has been assembled by Adam and Jean is really an important contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As someone who spent most of my life worrying about trade and who saw what structural change can do when it's not properly handled, and it's already been referred to earlier, to globalization and to stimulate negative forces like protectionism and like populism, the opportunity to work on the allocative effects of climate policies was really a great opportunity. And I want to thank Adam and Jean for giving me that opportunity, because I think the lessons that we have learned and the mistakes we made when it came to trade policy and dealing with globalization are in danger of being repeated with similar consequences for populism in the area of climate policy. Despite the aggregate evidence, or rather the evidence that the aggregate impacts are relatively modest, the distributional consequences of these policies, particularly when reduced to communities, and when they hit particular communities, can be extremely consequential, and their political consequences have been seismic in the US and elsewhere. We're now seeing it in Europe. So there's a great danger that we could be seeing a rejection of the climate policies. And I applaud the fund and others who are doing work at how we can come up with more compelling narratives to change the conversation about climate change. I'm also pessimistic that at the end of the day, there's a whole group of people that we're not going to convince. But as the book points out, what will convince them is when it becomes cheaper to adopt renewable energy and clean practices. And that is why the stress on innovation in this volume is so vital, because it's not only going to advance our ability to deal with climate change, but it's going to have political consequences in the sense that those who are not convincible are going to find they do the right thing for purely economic reasons. And so while I'm hopeful about new narratives, I think the point made earlier about the link between innovation, in stressing innovation, points to also the link to political economy. It's also, there's a lot of evidence that one reason structural policies are not working well, and Dustin Tingling at Harvard has done a lot of work on this, is that they are often not credible to the communities to whom they are offered. Because to be effective, just as in the case of investment, adjustment policies also need to be permanent and things that people can count on. And over the years, they found that these are not being implemented in a consistent fashion, and the result is they're greeted with great skepticism. In the book, I was given the opportunity in the study to sort of take a look at the structural policies in the United States and in Europe. And I was struck by the stark differences. We know about the use of prices versus subsidies at the aggregate level. But in terms of the differences in structural policies at the micro level, there are very significant differences. The Biden administration is to be congratulated on stressing the importance of place-based policies, but they've been unable actually to implement them on a significant scale at the federal level, independent of the other programs that they have implemented. So what they've done is to introduce place-based considerations in the infrastructure bill, in the CHIPS Act, and of course, in the IRA. So that, in a sense, is the good news. But the effect of doing the structural adjustment in the context of a climate policy initiative is really to skew the emphasis from what may be effective for an individual community in terms of its future prospects into trying to stress the opportunities for communities who are based on fossil fuels to become renewable energy hubs. Now, some are able to do so, but many will not be able to do so. And so for them, more tailored approaches that deal with the prospects of those individual communities are going to be necessary to have success. Another issue in the US context is that the subsidies and the policies have been actually extraordinarily broadly based. To qualify, something like 20% of the US labor force finds itself working in what is defined as an energy community. The policies are not zeroing in on those who are going to be most adversely affected and whose jobs are actually most at risk. I'm working on a paper at the moment trying to quantify the relationship between the investments in clean energy that are taking place and the jobs dependent on fossil fuel that are at risk. And what we find is that there are about 360,000 workers who are in the top rank when we order exposure to fossil fuels in terms of communities. And when we look at the announcements in clean investments, we find something like 1/6 of the jobs at risk will be compensated by the announced investments in clean energy. So purely in terms of transitional requirements, more policies are required to zero in those most adversely affected. Now, looking at Europe, there's a very different approach. The Europeans start off with very extensive spending on cohesion policies in general. One of the goals of the European community has been to narrow the income differences across Europe. And then above that is a much more generous program designed to deal with communities who are adversely affected by fossil fuels. And it's also a much more differentiated approach in which plans are negotiated between the Commission and individual threatened locations, so that rather than try to have one size fit all, which is perhaps unfair, but nonetheless the broad thrust of the approach in the US, there are plans worked out with workers and other social groups in order to try to restructure those individual communities. Now, Some will work, some will not. This is not an easy task to accomplish, but nonetheless, I think what we need to do in the United States is to move in the direction of complementing the policies we have with much more detailed policies for those at local levels, which have a broader focus in terms of creating opportunity. I think I'd like to encourage discussion. So I'll just end off having made that comparison and stressing that what we need to be thinking about now is how do we deal with the political forces that are becoming disenchanted with the current climate policies, because I think if you wanted to put an issue forward that would foster right-wing populism, climate change on policies, and the problem of climate change is unfortunately ideally crafted. Number one, it relies on the opinions of experts. Number two, the policies are being imposed externally and are required. So it's the politics of compulsion as opposed somehow to something that is quite natural. And of course, there's the reliance not only on markets, but also on government controls. And all of these things build up to the point where certainly if we look at the United States and we look at the emergence of the right in Europe, there is a growing backlash that we need to think about how to combat. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Can I ask all of our speakers to come up to the podium or to the panel? Given the depth in which our colleagues have already spoken, rather than having conversation among the panel, I'm going to open this up to questions from the floor. There is a moving mic coming from Jessica in the front part, or if you're near the back, there's a standing mic. You're not supposed to go to the back. You're supposed to come this way. Yes, thank you. Who would like to speak? Okay. Yeah. Do you want to go to the mic just behind you, please? If you could identify yourself, please.
That puts together the global economic fragmentation angle and the political economy angle. Isn't it possible that some degree of fragmentation may be necessary to solve the political economy problem? What I mean by that is that won't publics be more willing to buy into climate action if they have some sense that their governments are maintaining a modicum of sovereignty over that climate action? And won't that confidence in their government's action be reduced if they have a sense that because of geopolitical exposure, governments will lose control over their climate action?
Would anyone like to respond? Wow, you say the word sovereignty and no one wants to talk.
So there are different sources of fragmentation. And this is why I was asking Heather if she wanted to come in first. And some of them have, are quite legitimate. And for instance, efforts to improve energy security to some extent are absolutely legitimate. And you can see how dependence on one supplier that becomes a strategic adversary became something that had tremendous consequence for the price of energy in Europe in 2022. And so trying to diversify supplies, trying to move into different energy sources, all of the above, that would also improve energy security would certainly be welcome to some extent. The challenge is, I think, when measures of economic fragmentation reflect more the defense of domestic interests in ways that can be harmful to the climate transition. And so, for instance, we looked at, in a chapter of our World Economic Outlook last October, at the implications of rising fragmentation for geostrategic reasons in the space of commodities trading. And that is important because some of these commodities, critical minerals, are essential for the climate transition, building batteries and building solar panels, et cetera. And there you have a trade-off. You can, maybe to the extent that it's doing what you're suggesting, which is helping to protect domestic citizenry, but it might also delay and increase the cost of the transition. So it's not necessarily a win-win. There are many situations where it's not a win-win at all. We are particularly concerned when we see measures that have that take a sort of a zero-sum game view of the global trading system, and where somehow if you're moving a battery factory from one part of the world to a swing county in another part of the world, it's not exactly clear you're doing anything that helps the climate transition.
Heather and then Robert.
Yeah, to make a couple of comments on that. I mean, I think it's a really important question, right? Energy is so important to our economies, to our national and economic security. Being able to have access to it, being able to know that you're going to be able to deliver that in a consistent way is, of course, a first order national security issue. I think, though, that, and it's come up multiple times, it comes up in the book, it has come up in, I think, almost everyone's comments, that, all of this has to go through political economy considerations. And so I think one point where I would disagree, perhaps, with Pierre-Olivier is about the extent to which the trade-offs may reduce the pace of moving towards a clean energy transition. It may reduce the pace relative to what we as economists might predict in our models, which doesn't have all the frictions and the political economy considerations in the real world. But getting moving as quickly as possible requires keeping the public engaged and excited about the transition. So I think constantly trying to find that balance where you need people to see that this is in their best interest, that they are benefiting from this, that they are getting either that energy security or they are benefiting economically. The way to move as quickly as possible to get to a clean energy system and to deal with the catastrophic consequences of climate change is to embrace those political economy questions rather than see them as hurdles to action. So I think that just a little bit of a reconfiguration of that part of the question.
As a matter of empirical social science, and Heather, you and I have talked about this on various occasions a bit, how do we distinguish between officials and elected officials and policy appointees saying, we're doing the best we can, we're the realists, versus that's an excuse? So I think of the example that maybe not you, but several progressives raised with respect to the so-called neoliberal response to the financial crisis in 2008, 9, 10, where certain people said, including myself, we should do more fiscal, we should be restructuring loans and taking more away from the banks to our homeowners, and the responsible elected officials and their appointees all said, that's politically unrealistic, that's the best we can do now. And now you all are in charge and you're saying, don't be overly idealistic. So, I mean, genuinely, as a matter of, I empathize with both sets of officials, but I'm trying to understand how can we discern when it's not just an excuse of, oh my God, I feel overwhelmed, versus what's legitimate aspiration.
I will say in the climate realm, I think a really important metric of success is the extent to which the policies are durable. And let me just explain that for a moment. So just bounding it just in the climate realm. I think one of the challenges, and it's already been mentioned by a number of folks, one of the challenges with climate policy and clean energy policy is that for markets to act, they need certainty, right? They need to know the direction of policy. And yet that's been very difficult for the political system to deliver, especially in democracies where you have competing approaches to how you're going to address this. But one of the things that we've seen time and again is that when you put in place some sets of policies, they are retracted or they are watered down in particular ways. I think one of the things that I will be watching very carefully about the Invest in America agenda is the extent to which those have political durability. I have been very heartened to hear, particularly over the past 6 months or so, that, when talking to folks across the aisle, that there is less and less appetite for rescinding the core parts of the clean energy agenda. Now, there are some parts that seem a little bit more on the potential chopping block on the Republican side of the aisle than not, but some of the core pieces seem much more durable. And some of the reason for that is because, as Robert said, these, there are indications that these investments are happening all across the country. And so that's creating some political durability, which I think can help give markets more certainty. So I think your question is incredibly deep and profound and really important. And those of us who are in public office need to be holding ourselves accountable every day to achieving the goals that we need to achieve. So I'm hopeful, at least, but that is one metric that
No, thank you for that reply. I know you take that issue very seriously in self-scrutiny, so that's why I wanted to ask you. And of course, this is mapping to concerns that Pierre-Olivier and Jean both raised about credibility and macro speak. Robert, over to you, please.
Yeah, I think while sovereignty is important, I think I would pick up what people are talking about now, which relates to kind of stability and security, and it's not necessarily identical to self-sufficiency, because you get a lot of security if you diversify. That's a basic element in portfolio theory. So diversifying our trading partners is a critically important way we can make ourselves more secure. If we can, and this goes to deploying supply chains that service our economy, but allow developing countries, for instance, to participate in the green transition so that they see something in it for them as well as there being something in it for us. I also think that we should be avoiding straight-off inefficient policies that are blatantly hurting the green transition. Let's take a 25% tariff on steel imports and think about what it does to the cost of wind turbines. A wind turbine is like the Eiffel Tower with a propeller on it. I mean, basically, it's huge, huge amounts of metals going into it. Why would you be putting a tariff on that particular steel? Wouldn't you make an exception, perhaps, if you must have a tariff on steel in the first place for climate policy? I actually think the Biden administration followed a very rational policy to exploit the potential for trade when, for 2 years, it suspended the anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties that had been placed on solar panels that were coming into the United States. I personally think it did the wrong thing now in announcing that it's going to renew those tariffs. If we are trying to stimulate the development of the solar panel industry in the United States, surely, as we did up until very recently, we want to make sure that the producers have access to inputs that allow them to be competitive. So I think there are opportunities some dimensions of trade could be national security problems, but others can provide us opportunities to enhance the pace and indeed the stability of our structural initiatives.
We have time for one more brief question. Yes, please.
So Monica DeBole, Senior Fellow here at the Peterson Institute. And my question is on the issues pertaining to the Global South. So you talked a little bit about how, the Global South and Global South countries need investments in a lot of different areas and, the proper incentives to do certain things. But actually, the situation in the Global South is very heterogeneous. There are countries that have already fairly clean electricity matrices, if not, energy matrices per se. There are countries for which, the main carbon emission problem really doesn't have much to do with industry, but a lot more to do with deforestation. That is for a lot of Global South, the issue for a lot of Global South countries, in fact. And in other places, we have already seen in some countries the adoption or even the innovation or the technological innovation and investments in technological innovation leading to the establishment of green hydrogen industries. It's ongoing in Brazil, for example, at the moment. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about this heterogeneity and in what way some of these things can be incentivized further. Thank you.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask Pierre-Olivier and Jean to respond, and Jean gets the last word.
Yes, thanks, Monica. You're absolutely right. The situation in the Global South is very different in different countries. When we're looking at investment in green technologies overall, it remains the case, though, that advanced economies and China are more or less on track for the Paris Agreement targets, which is good news. The bad news is that the rest of the world, and that's most of the Global South, are not. So yes, there is heterogeneity. On the whole, it's not there yet, and the reasons are very clear. These are expensive propositions. There's not much in fiscal resources. There's a lot to do in terms of technology adoption. So we're saying that. Now, I'm maybe not going to answer directly your question, but maybe indirectly. One concern we have with the climate policies that are implemented in advanced economies and in China, and in particular, what we're seeing in terms of recourse to industrial policy and subsidies, and whether that's China, whether that's the US with the IRA, or whether that's the European Union, is that the Global South cannot compete in a subsidies race. And so they are being squeezed out of the green supply chain. In an ideal world, the Global South has its place, and the heterogeneity that you mentioned becomes relevant in terms of different countries taking different parts of that green supply chain. And they are the ones who are going to be squeezed out. And you see that very clearly when you talk to countries like Indonesia, or you talk to other countries. They are trying to protect. So what do they have? Well, they have the natural resources. They have the nickel, they have the cobalt, they have the lithium. And the message they get from the rest of the world, the advanced countries, is please sell us your stuff, preferably cheaply, and we'll take it from there, because we need the jobs. And that just doesn't work, right? And so that's, I think, is the first order issue. And then we can talk about how different countries, where they fall in terms of that supply. But that's the thing that we are trying to push back against. I'll stop here.
Jean?
Not much to add. I think the one community is the fact that one commonality in the Global South is the fact that whatever the way, decarbonization requires investment, and that the scarcity of savings and the cost of capital are massive obstacles. And that's true mostly in sort of a middle-income countries. Poor countries, they don't face this kind of challenge, but the middle-income countries that are key for the success or failure of climate change mitigation, they have no incentive really to sort of divert from less capital-intensive coal-powered plant, and I think that's vital. So I would say yes to the heterogeneity, but this subgroup faces really similar constraints.
Thank you. And with that, we'll close today's event with thanks to all our speakers, but in particular to Jean Pisani-Ferry, who edited with me and led the Green Frontier project, assessing the economic implications of climate action. We have an agenda for action, we have an agenda for discussion, we have an agenda supplemented by Heather's remarks for research, but we know this is about the most important agenda we got, so we're going to try to carry it forward. Thank you for joining us today.